Imagine you are an officer in the United States Army. You have a college degree from Howard University, perhaps even a master's from MIT. You have earned your wings after grueling months of training. You pilot the B-25 Mitchell bomber, one of the most advanced bomber planes in the world. You have studied trigonometry, meteorology, and aeronautical engineering. You are prepared to die for your country. But tonight, you are not a pilot. You are a prisoner. You are not being held by the Nazis in some frozen POW camp in Germany. You are not being held by the Japanese Empire in the jungles of the Pacific. You are being held behind barbed wire, guarded by K-9 units and machine guns with searchlights burning into your eyes all night long by your own government on American soil. April 1945. While the world celebrated the collapse of the Third Reich, while champagne bottles popped in London and Paris, a secret war was exploding in the heartland of America. In a span of just 2 days, the United States Army arrested over 100 officers, best officers. They were accused of mutiny. In wartime, the penalty for mutiny is death by firing squad. But these men hadn't refused to fly. They hadn't refused to fight. They hadn't deserted their posts. They had committed a crime far more dangerous in the eyes of their commanders. They had walked through a door. This is not just a story about segregation. This is the story of a high-stakes chess match between 101 brilliant young men and a military system desperate to break them. This is the mutiny that the Army tried to bury, but one of the earliest sparks that lit the fuse of the civil rights movement. This is the Freeman Field Mutiny. To understand the stakes, we have to go back to 1941. December 7th, Pearl Harbor. America entered the war. Black Americans rushed to recruiting stations by the thousands. They wanted to serve. They wanted to prove their loyalty. They wanted to fight fascism. But the United States Army didn't want them. Not really. The military was segregated by law. Black soldiers were placed in separate units, given the worst equipment, and assigned menial tasks. Digging latrines, loading supplies, cooking meals. The Army believed black men lacked the intelligence for complex tasks. The official policy stated, Negro troops are inferior in capacity, courage, and initiative. But pressure was mounting. Civil rights leaders like Philip Randolph threatened to organize a march on Washington. Eleanor Roosevelt lobbied her husband. The NAACP demanded action. So President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a compromise. He authorized the creation of an experimental program, the Tuskegee Airmen. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was born. These were fighter pilots, single-engine planes. They were supposed to fail. The military hoped they would wash out, proving once and for all that black men couldn't fly. But they didn't fail. They succeeded. By 1943, the Tuskegee fighter pilots were escorting bombers over Europe, racking up an incredible combat record. They became known as the Red Tails because of the distinctive red paint on their aircraft. The success of the Red Tails created a new problem for the Army. If black men could fly fighters, why couldn't they fly bombers? Bombers required even more skill. A B-25, Mitchell had a crew of 6, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, gunner. Each role required precision, mathematics, and the split-second decision-making. The Army couldn't keep saying no without exposing their racism. So in 1944, they created the 477th Bombardment Group. But this time, they had no intention of letting them succeed. The 477th was special. Everyone has heard of the Tuskegee fighter pilots, but the 477th Bombardment Group, they were the cream of the crop of black America. These weren't just young men looking for a job. These were scholars, engineers, lawyers, teachers. Some had degrees from Harvard, others from Fisk University, Howard University, and Ohio State. One was a former Golden Gloves boxing champion. Another was a concert pianist. They spoke multiple languages. They had studied physics and calculus. They had joined the war effort believing in the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad, and victory against racism at home. They believed that if they proved themselves in combat, America would finally see them as equals. But the Army had no intention of letting them win at home. The 477th became a unit nobody wanted. From the moment it was formed, it was treated like a disease. First, they were sent to Selfridge Field in Michigan. The base commander refused to let them use the facilities. The white officers threatened to resign if they had to serve alongside black officers. Racial tensions exploded. Fistfights broke out. The Army panicked and moved them. Next stop, Bombardment Field in Kentucky. The base was half finished. No proper runways, no equipment. Your training was sabotaged at every turn. White instructors would cancel flights at the last minute. Aircraft were mysteriously unavailable. Maintenance was delayed. The 477th couldn't train because the Army didn't want them to succeed. Then in March 1945, they were moved again, this time to Freeman Field in Seymour, Indiana. A beautiful base. Modern facilities, proper runways. The men hoped this would be different. They hoped someone in command finally saw their potential. They were wrong. Waiting for them at Freeman Field were two men who represented the old guard of American racism. General Frank O. D. Hunter and his subordinate, Colonel Robert Selway. General Frank Hunter was a decorated World War I veteran. He had flown combat missions over France. He was respected in military circles. He was also openly, unapologetically racist. He once famously said, "Racial friction will be solved if the Negro just accepts his place." He believed black officers were inherently inferior. He didn't want them commanding white troops, and he certainly didn't want them socializing with white officers in the same club. Colonel Robert Selway was Hunter's enforcer, a by-the-book officer who followed orders without question. If Hunter wanted segregation, Selway would deliver it. But both men had a legal problem. Army Regulation 210-10. This regulation, issued by the War Department in Washington, stated clearly, officers' clubs, messes, and recreational facilities will be open to all officers at the post, regardless of race. It was a clear law, federal law. You cannot ban an officer from a club based on the color of his skin. Yes, if Selway put up a sign that said whites only, he would be court-martialed for violating direct Army policy. The NAACP would sue. The black press would explode. Washington would have his head. So Hunter and Selway decided to play a game. They decided to cheat the system. Freeman Field had 2 officers' clubs. Club number 2 was beautiful. A 2-story building with hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, a full bar stocked with whiskey and bourbon, a billiards table, a tennis court outside, and even a small library. It was where officers relaxed after a long day of training. Club number 1 was a joke. It was a renovated supply shack. Peeling paint, a few rickety chairs, no bar, no entertainment. The black officers nicknamed it Uncle Tom's Cabin. Colonel Selway issued a new order, and he didn't use the words black and white. He was too smart for that. Instead, he classified all personnel on the base into 2 groups: instructors, officers permanently assigned to Freeman Field; trainees, officers temporarily training at Freeman Field. He then declared that Club number 2, the Luxury Club, was for instructors only. Trainees would use Club number 1. On paper, it looked neutral. In reality, it was segregation by loophole. Every single black officer at Freeman Field was classified as a trainee, even if they had been there for months. Every white officer, even those who had just arrived that week, was classified as an instructor. But the insult went even deeper. White enlisted men, non-commissioned sergeants with no college degrees, were allowed into Club Number 2. Civilian contractors working on the base? Allowed in. And here's the sickest part. German prisoners of war, captured Nazi soldiers working on the base as laborers, were allowed to use the same latrines, the same dining halls, and the same recreational spaces as the white officers. Think about that. The enemy. Men who had shot at American soldiers in Europe. Men who had fought for Adolf Hitler. They had more rights on an American military base than the black officers wearing the United States Army uniform. The men of the 477th weren't just angry. They were educated. They were strategists. They understood the law better than their commanders did. Late at night, they held secret meetings in the latrines. The only place on base they were sure wasn't bugged. Among them was Lieutenant Coleman Young, a future mayor of Detroit. There was Marsden Thompson, a sharp lawyer from New Jersey. Were Roger Terry, a quiet man from Los Angeles who had studied engineering. Shirley Clinton, a soft-spoken officer who believed deeply in justice. They debated their options. They couldn't use violence. If they threw a single punch, the MPS would shoot them down, and the military would call it justified. They couldn't simply complain through official channels. Their white commanders ignored every petition, every letter, every formal request. So they decided to use the Army's own rules against it. They formed a plan. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. And it required nerves of steel. The plan: they would enter the White Officers Club in small groups. They would be polite. They would be calm. They would ask for service. When they were refused entry, they would force the military police to arrest them. Why? Because an arrest creates a paper trail. A paper trail leads to charges. Charges lead to a court-martial. And a court-martial would force the Army to publicly defend an illegal order. The world would be watching. It was a gamble. If it worked, they could expose the system. If it failed, they could be executed for mutiny. The night of April 5th, 1945. The air was cold. The sky was clear. Small groups of black officers began walking across the base toward the instructors' club. They wore their dress uniforms, polished shoes, crisp ties. They looked like soldiers, because that's exactly what they were. At the door of Club Number 2 stood Major Andrew White, the Provost Marshal, and several armed military police guards. The first group, led by Lieutenant Marsden Thompson, approached the entrance. The marshal blocked the doorway. His hand rested on his holstered pistol. "This club is for instructors only," Major White said firmly. Lieutenant Thompson looked him in the eye. "We are officers of the United States Army. We have a right to be here under Army Regulation 210-10. The marshal didn't budge. "You are trainees. This facility is restricted." Thompson didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stepped forward and walked through the doorway, gently pushing past the marshal. He jostled him, not violently, just enough to get through. Chaos erupted. Inside the club, white officers froze. Glasses clinked onto tables. The jukebox music stopped. Someone shouted, "What the hell is going on?" Major White screamed for backup. "Arrest these men, now!" MPS grabbed Thompson and his group. They were dragged outside and placed under armed guard. But as soon as the first group was arrested, the second group stepped up to the door. Then the third. Then the fourth. It was a coordinated wave. Every 15 minutes, a new group of black officers arrived, calmly demanding entry. The base jail filled up. The MPs didn't have enough handcuffs. Officers were lined up outside under armed guard, standing in the cold Indiana night. By the end of the night, 36 officers were in custody. But they didn't stop. The next night, April 6th, 25 more officers walked up to the club. The base was in chaos. Colonel Selway was furious. He called General Hunter in a panic. Hunter's response was chilling. "I'd be delighted for them to commit technical mutiny. Then we can hang them." They wanted blood. They wanted an example, and now they were going to manufacture one. The arrests alone weren't enough. Colonel Selway needed to pin a serious crime on these men, so he created a new document, Base Regulation 85-2. This regulation explicitly outlined the segregated club rules. It stated in black and white that trainee officers were forbidden from entering the instructors' club. Then Selway did something unprecedented in military history. He ordered every black officer on the base, all 422 of them, to report to a room, one by one, read the document, and sign it. This was the trap. If an officer signed the document, he was legally agreeing to segregation. He was accepting his status as a second-class citizen. He was endorsing a Jim Crow policy on a federal military installation. If he refused to sign, he was disobeying a direct order from a superior officer in wartime. Article 64 of the Articles of War. The penalty for violating Article 64 in wartime is death by firing squad. They were literally asking these men to choose: sign away your dignity or risk your life. April 11th, 1945. One by one, the black officers were marched into a room. Colonel Selway sat at the head of a long table flanked by his staff officers. The tension in the room was suffocating. An officer was called forward. He stood at attention. "Lieutenant, do you understand this regulation?" "I do, sir." "Will you sign it?" Silence. The room held its breath. "No, sir." Selway's face turned red. "I am giving you a direct order. If you do not sign this document, you will be placed under arrest. Do you understand the consequences?" "Yes, sir." "Will you sign?" "No, sir." Imagine the courage that took. These men were in their early 20s. They had parents waiting for them back home. They had younger siblings looking up to them. They had girlfriends, fiancées, wives. They had futures, careers, dreams. Yet, one by one, 101 men looked their commanding officer in the eye and said, "No." They refused, knowing full well it could mean their death. The United States Army didn't know what to do with 101 mutineers. They couldn't execute them all. The optics would be catastrophic. But they couldn't let them walk free either. So they decided to break them psychologically. On April 13th, 1945, the 101 officers were loaded onto military transport planes. No one told them where they were going. No one told them what would happen next. They flew in silence, guarded by armed MPs. They landed at Bombardment Field in Kentucky. This wasn't a base. This was a prison. The barracks were surrounded by double rows of barbed wire. Guard towers loomed at each corner, manned by soldiers with rifles. Searchlights were positioned to shine directly into the barracks windows all night long, making sleep nearly impossible. Armed military police with attack dogs patrolled the perimeter. The mess hall was closed. The officers were fed cold sea rations. the same food given to soldiers in combat zones. They were cut off from the world. No phone calls, no letters in or out. Their families had no idea where they were. For all their loved ones knew, they had vanished. For weeks they sat there in that Kentucky prison camp, waiting to see if the United States Army would execute them. But the Army made a critical mistake. They underestimated the power of the black press. Before the arrests, some of the officers had smuggled letters out to trusted contacts. Those letters reached the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely read black newspapers in America. They reached the Chicago Defender. They reached the NAACP headquarters in New York City. The story exploded. Headlines screamed, 101 Army officers arrested for demanding equal rights. U.S. Army runs prison camp for black pilots. Thurgood Marshall, the brilliant NAACP lawyer, who would later become the first black Supreme Court justice, got involved. He flew to Kentucky to investigate. He interviewed the imprisoned officers. He documented everything. The story landed on the desk of the War Department in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, generals were sweating. Congressmen were asking questions. The optics were a nightmare. The United States was fighting a war against Nazi Germany, a regime built on racial supremacy, while simultaneously running what looked like a concentration camp for its own black officers. The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. The government panicked. Orders came down from Washington. Release the men, now. But General Hunter demanded blood. He insisted that someone had to be punished. The Army couldn't just let everyone walk away. So, a compromise was reached. They would release 98 of the officers with a letter of reprimand, a permanent black mark on their service records that would follow them for the rest of their lives, ruining job prospects and denying them veterans' benefits. But to save face, to send a message, the Army would prosecute 3 men as ringleaders in a full court-martial. Yet the 3 men chosen were Lieutenants Marsden Thompson, Shirley Clinton, and Roger Terry. The trial began in July 1945 at Freeman Field. The prosecution was confident. They had generals testifying. They had signed orders. They had military law on their side. But the defense had something more powerful. They had the truth. The defense team, led by Theodore Berry, a brilliant black lawyer from Cincinnati, didn't argue about whether the men had disobeyed an order. They argued about whether the order itself was legal. Berry stood before the military judges and systematically dismantled Colonel Selway's defense. He presented Army Regulation 210-10. He showed that the trainee versus instructor classification was a fabrication, a sham designed solely to enforce racial segregation. He proved that white officers with less experience were classified as instructors, while black officers with more training were kept as trainees. He argued a principle that would echo through military law for decades. A soldier is not required to obey an illegal order. The military judges were cornered. The evidence was overwhelming. The logic was undeniable. The Army's own regulations condemned Selway's actions. In a shocking turn of events, the court acquitted Marsden Thompson and Shirley Clinton of all charges of disobedience and mutiny. It was a massive, unprecedented victory. But the Army couldn't let everyone walk free. They needed one conviction, one scalp to hang on the wall. So they turned their fury on Roger Terry. They couldn't convict him of mutiny. They couldn't convict him of disobeying orders. So they dug into the events of that night in April and found the smallest, pettiest charge imaginable, jostling a superior officer. Roger Terry had gently pushed past Major White to enter the club. That was it, a bump, a nudge, the kind of accidental contact that happens 100 times a day on any military base. The court convicted him. The sentence? A fine of $150, loss of rank, and a dishonorable discharge. For bumping into a man, Roger Terry's life was destroyed. He was stripped of his officer's commission, stripped of his pilot's wings, stripped of his right to vote in certain states, kicked out of the Army in disgrace. He would carry that shame for 50 years. The 477th Bombardment Group never saw combat. The war in Japan ended in August 1945, before they could deploy overseas. The unit was quietly disbanded, or the men were scattered across the country, sent back to a nation that still didn't see them as equals. For 50 years, the Freeman Field Mutiny was buried. The Army didn't want to talk about it. History books didn't mention it. The 101 officers carried those letters of reprimand in their files like scars. They were denied federal jobs, denied promotions, looked at with suspicion by employers who saw reprimand on their discharge papers. Roger Terry worked odd jobs. He drove trucks. He struggled to make ends meet. He couldn't talk about his service without feeling shame. But they knew what they had achieved. Late at night, in reunions held in church basements and VFW halls, they would gather and remember. They knew they had sent a shock wave through the United States military. Just 3 years after Freeman Field, in 1948, your President Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office reviewing military reports. He read about the chaos segregation caused. He read about the wasted talent, the ruined careers, the legal nightmares. And on July 26, 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the entire United States Armed Forces. The 101 men had lost their careers, but they had changed the world. It took half a century, 50 long years. But in August 1995, the United States Air Force held a ceremony in Atlanta, Georgia. Elderly men, some in wheelchairs, some using canes, gathered in their old uniforms. The Assistant Secretary of the Air Force stood before them. He formally acknowledged that the actions of the Freeman Field officers were not mutiny. They were heroism. He announced that the Air Force was removing the letters of reprimand from every officer's file. The stain was erased. Their honor was restored. And then he called forward one man, Roger Terry, now in his 70s, a man who had lived 50 years under the shadow of a dishonorable discharge. The Assistant Secretary looked him in the eye and apologized, on behalf of the United States Air Force, on behalf of a nation that had failed him. He restored Terry's rank to major. He refunded the $150 fine with 50 years of interest, and he erased the dishonorable discharge from his record. But Roger Terry wasn't satisfied. He looked at the secretary and said, "I want my wings back. I want my dignity back." And that day, in front of cameras, in front of his fellow officers, in front of a nation that finally understood what he had sacrificed, they pinned the silver pilot's wings back onto his chest. Roger Terry stood tall, tears streaming down his face, a free man, a vindicated man, a hero. The Freeman Field Mutiny teaches us a lesson that echoes across generations. Sometimes patriotism isn't about blindly following orders. Sometimes patriotism is about having the moral courage to say no when the orders are wrong. These men didn't fight the Nazis in the skies over Berlin. They didn't drop bombs on Tokyo. But they fought a war far more personal, far more dangerous. They fought for the soul of America. They fought for the principle that all men, regardless of the color of their skin, deserve dignity, respect, and equal treatment under the law. And in the end, against impossible odds, they won. Their legacy lives on. Every black pilot who flies for the Air Force today. Every officer who serves without fear of segregation. Every soldier who knows that an illegal order can and should be challenged. They owe a debt to the 101 men of Freeman Field. Remember their names. Remember their courage. Remember that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is walk through a door you've been told you can't enter.